Welcome and thank you for joining us. We're here to share highlights from this semester's String Ensemble course, a co-taught collaboration between our School of Music's orchestra and chamber music programs in response to the ongoing pandemic. During this time, we re-envisioned ways of making music together, challenging boundaries between the worlds of chamber music and symphony orchestra, and inviting our string players to consider the skill sets and values of collaborative music making that are shared among these two instrumental traditions and domains. Through in-person and virtual means, our students engaged with music and stayed connected to one another, as you will hear in the performance excerpts from this video.
In order to adapt to the unique conditions and scenarios of the coronavirus pandemic, our class embarked on a sequence of 15 rotating small group performance projects, each culminating in a recording session. This tapestry of varied collaborations, in addition to our weekly online meetings, made for a remarkable group spirit, even though we never gathered as a whole class in person.
We also wanted to bring the work of these in-person chamber projects to our virtual classroom and asked a few groups to perform for their peers over Zoom.
Yeah.
Embracing the necessity of virtual distanced coursework amid the pandemic, we launched online projects to contextualize the art and the act of musical performance. Students explored the history and documentation of the School of Music in an archival project coordinated by Adriana Flores and Angela Weaver from our Collins Memorial Library. Others worked on a database to gather and disseminate information about composers of color and their compositions. We also used online tools to, as a class, make a virtual asynchronous recording of Florence Price's Adoration.
A group of us, who's named on the slide, have been looking through the archives and developing a presentation about the School of Music and the Symphony Orchestra, and our history for this past semester. And we didn't want to just lecture you about it, so we have, with the help of others, developed a fun little interactive engagement with our sources.
We also really wanted to ask, the question, why should we study the archives? Why is this important? And we all agree that understanding our past will help us understand what's coming in the future.
Part of the idea with this project is that it's not this looking back at School of Music history doesn't end with this presentation, and so hopefully some of the stuff that we've started to look at is kind of the tip of the iceberg and inspires more people to continue digging back, and hopefully it can get a little bit more integrated into what music students do for classes and ensembles and stuff. And so hopefully the collection that we're sharing with you guys of what we found is just, like it says here, the foundation for future research.
I'm Chris. I'm a sophomore bass performance major, and I was one of the project leaders for the database project. And so the purpose of this project was to catalog and promote works by composers of color. And the goal for this is eventually to turn it into a public-facing website where people can access works by composers of color in an organized and accessible format so that it will facilitate greater engagement and programming with these works. This is the Jamboard that we created to catalog all of the improvements that we want to make for the site. So we took all the pieces that we currently have there and we looked at all the instrumentations, and then we came up with a way of standardizing them.
And the goal of all of this is just to make it so that we can move towards it being a public-facing resource, and that somebody who doesn't know what it is can come to the page and quickly understand how they might be able to use it for their own purposes, to discover music they don't know, or to share pieces they do know that other people would like to know.
Integrated throughout and in dialogue with these projects was a virtual series of guest speakers and clinicians, kicked off by a wonderful visit from members of Sphinx Virtuosi and culminating in a presentation by native Hawaiian cellist and experimental artist Nava Lanzalati on indigenous approaches to musical creativity. Our guest speakers shared ideas and experiences with us about community engagement, diversity, and what it means for music making to become more representative and inclusive.
First of all, know your audience. Be willing to learn about your audience in a way where you can even bring something to them that speaks to them, speaks to their home, speaks to their community, speaks to them on a level where they might recognize anything, the title, who first sang it, who first made it. If you put music to a poem, maybe it's a poem that, resonates with that community, let's say. So I feel like people appreciate when we make the effort to meet them versus just speaking at them. And then it sort of automatically opens a bridge so that it's a two-way street. And again, I would say that community engagement, it's important that it is back and forth so that it's not just one way.
One time, I had an outreach thing in a school, and we'd done all this work, made sure that the composers were very diverse, made sure the players were very diverse, and we talk about all of these things, blah, blah, blah. And toward the end, this little girl raised her hand, and her question was, she was like, I have a question. I'm like, yeah, what's your question? Assuming it'd be something about the pieces we played. And she said, do girls play classical music? And I was just like, of course. But then I looked around, and it was like 4 guys playing in a quartet who played all male composers.
We have to become more specific. Why do we care? Why is it important? What do they mean when they say we're committed to the diversity of arts in America? Committed how? How do you define art? Whose art? Are we talking high art? Are we talking craft? All of these definitions and specificities we can really dig into. And I think there are exciting possibilities for the way that relates to just mediums of sound. I mean, for me as an experimental artist, fragmentation for me became an aesthetic that I tied to indigenous experimental performance. Because for me, that fragmentation, a multiplicity of identities, digging into the specificity of a sound, right? And maybe having that fragmentation be an aesthetic was, to me, kind of representative.
These conversations with guest artists invited us to think about how we value music and how those values are shaped and articulated. Our guests offered examples of creatively forged musical paths that navigated beyond Western classical music to include other styles and practices, such as hip-hop production, bluegrass, and folk, as well as non-Western traditions like Hindustani call and response. These visits and workshops helped us explore new musical skills and means of listening.
I just wanted to keep learning new things. And so for me, I kind of found that outlet by learning new styles of music and trying to improvise and compose. And I think I had this odd philosophical dream that, like, if I'm going to be a musician, I thought it should be important that I should play all the kinds of music I like to listen to. So ever since school, I've just kind of kept trying to learn new stuff. And I keep seeing people do things that I wish I could do, and try and figure out how I can get from here to there. So that in a weird way was inspiring to me, and I've tried to put in the work in various styles so that I feel like I can participate in a musical conversation, and I guess that's ultimately now what I enjoy most, is collaborating with musicians of different cultures and different backgrounds.
Engaging with the music and musicians of today is an important and enlivening practice. Our virtual guest artist visits allowed us to collaborate with and perform music by composers of today. We also collaborated with the School of Music composition class of Dr. Robert Hutchinson so that our ensemble members could help bring their new works to life. Our class felt the personal impact of playing music written by people they have met, heard, questioned, and understood. This type of engagement completes and connects our musical performance practice to an unbroken stream of vital, vibrant artistic intentions from hundreds of years ago to the present day.
In 1964, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, there were these 3 civil rights workers that were killed. So I grew up, hearing these types of stories, which again greatly affected the way that I viewed the world, and then later on sort of shaped the way that I sort of viewed music and creating music. Earlier on in the pandemic, you had a lot of organizations that were trying to bring art back to the city. New York Philharmonic ended up doing a thing called New York Phil Bandwagon, and what they ended up doing was they painted a truck. And they drove around to 9 different parks around the city, and they would take chamber groups from the New York Philharmonic to play in these different parks, and people from all over the city would come and gather to hear this music played. I decided to, to sort of focus on this aspect of rebirth, that New York City was going to be reborn after the pandemic, but then also focusing on, African American culture a little bit. I really do want to stress that, you really do have to forge your own path. There's literally only one of you in this world, so it's very important to just go there.
lot of work that I have that like sans or like acharanga that doesn't actually specifically involve Indian musicians. And to that extent, again, there are definitely resources where if you want to hear the rag that acharanga is in, you can certainly go and listen to it and do that. But you don't have to do that to be able to play the piece, because in a way, if I'm writing it for Western musicians, I want for Western musicians to also feel that their training is valid, and not that they need to like learn to be an Indian musician in order to feel like they have a, you know, a authentic approach to the piece. And, you know, to me, it's just this litmus test, this idea of like, if someone wants to play it in a completely, you know, Western romantic style, that's totally possible. If they want to play it as an Indian classical musician with gamak and stuff like that, they can absolutely do that. And I like that my music is flexible enough to kind of allow for me to see what people want to bring to it, and it teaches me a lot. Make it so that it's a really a generative environment that's conducive to building relationships. And that can be done with notes and rhythms and orchestration and textures if you're asking those questions. So, you know, those are questions I ask, and they're not just questions I ask just in my mind. I also ask them to Saili.
So the very core of any kind of a collaborative process is, I think, trust. And trusting Reena, just trusting the process that she brings to the table has helped me immensely to push myself. And I think that's at the very core of every collaborative process.
And now I feel like I draw elements of Hindustani music when I'm in a Western classical and vice versa. Like reading sheet music and being able to understand rhythm and having that structure helps so much with Hindustani, especially when we're working in this kind of setting with orchestras. It really helps like cross barriers and work with different musicians when you have that kind of baseline notation to communicate across. And similarly, I think Hindustani music teaches you how to find creativity and flexibility within structure. And in Western music, sometimes we're taught to like read what's on the page, and it can feel very locked in at times. But with Hindustani, it really teaches you how to interpret that and the different ways that you can interpret like the given notes that are on a page.
Especially this time in our world, you know, being able to listen in different ways and listen for different things is a really important skill. So it's amazing to hear Palini talk about, you know, the ways in which she has had these different trainings and is able to kind of find these moments of connection between them, and moments where those different ways to listen can open up different ways to recontextualize each musical practice.
Re re ga
re re ga
ga ma re
ma ni re
ga re sa ni
ga re sa ni
ni ga sa
ni sa.
बहुत अच्छे. So through the tradition of singing and repeat, it's the approach towards improvisation that the guru is imbibing, and a guru is teaching and the student is imbibing, and this approach is what then translates into a performance. Ram tori maya,
Ram tori maya,
naach nachave,
naach nachave.
And Reena, as a follow-up question to that, maybe could you respond to how you sort of take those practices and traditions and incorporate them into the transcription that you created of this piece for Western string quartet and two Hindustani singers.
In this particular piece, what I wanted to do is have, there's a reason why there's two singers and it's not just one singer. It's because they can kind of help each other navigate the space of coming to it from a completely Hindustani perspective and then moving into a Western perspective. So the first voice you hear, and I'm so glad Palini is here too, because she's the other singer on the recording. She is singing literally the thing that Saili was teaching you. And so that's an idea. If you studied with an Indian guru and you just learned that piece, that's exactly what you would sing. The second voice is for someone who is a little bit more experienced in Hindustani music and it's experienced maybe with Western music, where there's a little bit of counterpoint where they don't come in at exactly the right time. Maybe they omit a word or two to get, that extra get ahead to come into a certain phrase. They sing in harmony with one another. And those are things that Hindustani musicians don't technically do classically, but that they could.
You guys are in a time where you are building your future, and knowing that this has happened during such a crucial time for you guys, know that you guys have the power to create the future, and you guys are rising up through your degree and into the professional world. So I would say just take the time to dream about what you want the future to look like, because you guys will be creating that future for all of us in sooner than you might think. So yeah, I think that should hopefully empower you as well to feel free to create.